Fern, are you there? Okay, I'm not sure what's happening. I see Fern's microphone, and we were just talking to her before, but for some reason we can't hear her. So, Regina, how about if I turn it over to you? And
I don't know if I'm frozen or if we're all frozen.
oh, there you go. You're back, Fern.
Okay.
All right. So the floor is yours. Thank you.
I seem to be back online.
You're
Okay.
good. Go. I turned it over to you.
Good morning. Thank you, Nicole. Okay. All right. Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the June HR Roundtable meeting. I'm Fern Roten, Factory Outlet Manager for Simon Pierce and Chair of the HR Roundtable Steering Committee for the Garrett County Chamber of Commerce. We are very pleased to welcome Jeannette Rudy Fitzwater, owner of J.R. Fitzwater and Associates and registered corporate coach, as our guest speaker today. Jeannette brings over 30 years of varied executive and management experience in human resources, training, strategic planning, and marketing and sales. And this morning, she's going to be talking to us about the roles of introverts and extroverts in the workplace. Thank you, Jeannette.
Jeanette's microphone is muted.
Jeannette, oh, there you go, Jeannette.
Okay, now can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, sorry about that. I didn't know I needed to unmute my own. Okay, well, I was laughing about the fact that whenever I hear that kind of write-up, I always think, gee, I want to say, and I started when I was 4, but of course I didn't. Most of you know that. So just like the rest of you have had a nice career in Garrett County, I've been very pleased with that, and it just extended a little more over the last couple of years. So good to be back with my colleagues and friends sitting around talking about HR and really workforce issues. I guess now it's been, I'm going to say 7 or 8 months ago that Regina contacted me and said, you know, we would like to, sometime during this year to have you talk about this subject of introverts versus extroverts. And it's similar to some of the things you have heard from me in the past, but it's important to know because as we've said up front, there are a variety of people in the workplace. And if you work with everyone and treat everyone and manage them all the same, you're only going to be successful with a small group. And that really points to your productivity and your return on equity and all the good things that we look for as businesses and companies. So I'm not able to advance the slide for some reason. Nicole, would there be a reason why I can't advance my slide today?
I don't think so. And I don't actually have access to your slides because they're on your screen. So try moving your cursor down towards the left hand and try to just click. Do you see those little arrows? Go back down. There you
there
go.
it went. It moved. Okay, that's a good sign. We'll hope it'll keep moving. So speaking of arrows, we're talking really about this idea of introverts and extroverts. And the one thing I'd like to mention right up front that almost concerns me about the title, but it is exciting, is that these are the extremes. Most people fall somewhere in between these arrow tips. You're probably not a full introvert. You're probably not a full extrovert. Now, we will be talking about things and we'll be talking about traits that may land a little bit on those extremes, but realize most people fall within, and this certainly isn't to be about actually labeling people. It's just about getting to understand people better. So what we hope to achieve today as a group is, first of all, to help you to recognize and predict reactions of these two groups and maybe being able to assimilate the groups in between. So it's not a surprise when they act a certain way. And then also to think what I think really makes this interesting as opposed to 7 or 8 months ago when we thought about this, how does it apply to where we are now, this whole COVID thing? And then as we're gradually coming out of that, what's it going to look like going forward? And what's the input? What's the thought with these individual styles, how they're going to react and what we need to do? And I'm hoping at that point we can open up a little bit of conversation, because I certainly don't have all the answers, but I think it's interesting thought process to go through. And then lastly, of course, you're looking for some takeaway on what can I do differently? And we'll have some tips for how to manage these two styles. And I do want to point out as we go through the slides, there's a fair amount of text. I know some of you that sit in the front row, we were laughing about that earlier, will want to take notes. That's totally fine. But I do want to make you aware that not only are they recording the session, I've made my slides available, and I believe Regina will be happy to send those out to you later. So you don't have to take lots and lots of notes if you don't choose to. So as I was thinking about this, what are we talking about as an introvert? So, I went to the dictionary, of course, online these days, and the extreme introvert that we would be discussing, they refer to as a shy, reticent person. So it's someone you don't hear from all the time, someone that's maybe a little bit more thoughtful, they're thinking it through. Those of us that are a little more on the other extreme sometimes wonder what an introvert is thinking, because they're thinking without talking many times. So that's kind of a sign of what you see many times with what we're referring to as an introvert. So what I'd like you to do is, in your chat box, if you would, I want you to think about introverts and think of the people that you can think of that may fall within that kind of category in general. What are some of the best things? What are the best traits that they bring into your workplace? And just, 1, 2, 3 words, if you would chat, some things that you've observed that have been really good about the fact that you have some introverts in your workplace. And I'll pause for just a moment. And again, that would be just typing into your chat. Thoughtful and perspective. You're absolutely right, Janice. And for those of us, some of us that tend to talk a little bit more, I guess I wouldn't be in this business if I didn't, we sometimes miss that because they're back thinking about it. And sometimes they've picked up on things that maybe some of the rest of us haven't. And Chuck, you're right, they're good listeners. They are thinkers. We're going to talk some more about many times they're somewhat analytical, especially as they get further out on that area, and non-reactive. And for those of us that look for reactions, sometimes we wonder about that. But it's not that they're not thinking, they just haven't necessarily shared it with us. And as Nicole says, very focused. You can count on that. They don't like to be interrupted, and considerate, empathetic, Melissa, Amy, observant, absolutely. So those are some great comments, and you're exactly right. So even if we may be of a little different style, these are really good things in our workplace, and we need that. And in case I forget to mention it, you do not want a workplace that has everyone of the same style, because you'll be missing much opportunity. So it's important to put to use the great traits that you see with the introverts and those that are just show some of those traits but may not be to the extreme. Thank you for your comments. So here's the other side when we're talking about extremes. This is the extrovert. Now this person you hear from, they're outgoing, they express their opinions, they don't hide them. Sometimes they even start their opinions, start talking before they've even formed all their opinions, which can be very frustrating for those that are a little bit more introverted, but it's just a style. And we need that too. So what is really good in your organization as you think about the extroverts that you have? What kinds of traits, a word or two, do they bring to your workplace to round you out? Amy's right, social and willing to share. They're going to speak up. Energetic. Yes, there's an enthusiasm and an energy. You're right, Nicole. And that can actually be almost cheerleading for the team. Socially oriented and outgoing, Chuck's right there too. Those are all things that you see with someone that's just a little bit more extroverted. They can bring energy to the team, excitement, maybe great for brainstorming, those kinds of things. So you certainly need all those traits. Creative, yes, they are the creative ones. They're sometimes even start with one subject and move to the other one because they're so excited and it just went there. So very good. Thank you for your comments again. So there are great traits that are brought on both ends of the spectrum, if you think of them as extremes. And several of the things you talked about, but just to give you a kind of a quick list, which goes along with what you said. If you're looking at this continuum of extroverted and introverted and what's in between, as we said, the extrovert is going to be much more talkative. That's how they think. That's how they communicate. The introvert is a little bit more quieter. They're a little more reserved with their thoughts. They think it through before they say anything. They're not necessarily driven by being sociable, and sometimes pushing them into a sociable situation is not always that comfortable. Now, again, that's the extreme. Doesn't mean that they can't, but they want to be prepared and have a little more of a purpose many times. They can certainly come across the introvert as shy, whereas the extrovert is clearly outgoing, to the point sometimes of even taking over the conversation if it goes to the extreme. We talked about the enthusiasm, the optimist of the extrovert. One of the things we'll talk about later is generally the extrovert wants to see that there's good, there's something positive at the end. And even if you're working through a crisis, they want to see that light at the end of the tunnel, that they can get there and that the team believes in that. Whereas the introvert is thinking back, they may be just a little bit more passive. We'll talk later, sometimes they might even be a little skeptical at first because that's kind of their go-to reaction. You can certainly count on the introvert to be reliable. They're there, you know, they're on it. Extrovert, a little touchy, you know, they can get sometimes concerned about things. They're very active, they like movement, they talk with their hands. You can't see me right now, I'm talking with my hands. Whereas the introvert is a little calmer, a little more even conversation. Sometimes they can be perceived as rigid because, you know, they get their idea, they base it on fact, and it is how it is. Whereas the extrovert is a little bit more assertive and jumps in there. So these are just some basic traits. So if you're trying to think, gosh, I don't know who we have that might be in these categories, look at these types of stylistic things that they do and see how they fall. I mean, you've heard me say many times, taking profiles and things are a great way to find out, but just simply observing some of these things will certainly tell you a lot about your team. So if these are all the great things that can happen with an introvert and an extrovert coming together, we do know that sometimes they will literally collide. Some of the workforce concerns, some of that kind of back and forth that's going on that can divide things, or in this case, we say collide, can be negative, at least in the short run. So I'm going to ask you, if you would, if anybody has a story, and certainly we're not asking for names, but you know, what does happen when this comes about? Feel free to type in speak. Okay, Fern told me earlier that, well, here we come up with some. Okay, Chuck has one-sided perspectives and conversations. I think you're exactly right. Chuck, would you mind unmuting and just telling us a little bit about that?
Yep, sorry. Yeah, a lot of times, you know, the extrovert, you know, because of all that energy, can overwhelm the conversation, and without recognizing the cues, you know, the introvert just won't say anything, or you know, they'll be actively listening, but you know, their perspective, you know, isn't shared, you know, because it's just been too dominated by the extrovert.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And the sad part is, so often the extrovert assumes, well, they didn't say anything, so they must obviously agree with me, which is not always the case. Right, Chuck?
Yeah, exactly.
That's wonderful. Thank you.
Sure.
And Melissa, anything on your end that you'd like to talk about? How I think that's a lot of what Chuck said, but if you would like to unmute, feel free.
Yeah, I totally agree with what he was saying. I heard someone wise once say, like, extroverts are the people who need to be seen, and the introverts are the people who need to see others. And so a lot of times I notice Extroverts dominate because they have that need to be seen in a conversation without thinking other people have valuable opinions to share as well.
That's great. And if you don't mind, I might steal that. I think that's really good. That is exactly right. So good. Yeah, that does happen. And we have to be careful. And certainly those of us in the room that are on the screen, I guess, that are managing people need to keep that in mind and watch for those signs so we can make sure that everybody's voice is heard at the right time. And we'll talk a little bit about how to maybe do that more effectively. So thank you. So these are the basic things that happen regardless of the economy, regardless of all the political stance, whatever is going on in the world. These things have gone on, you know, for an infinitum, just forever. And then this happened. It's a scary thought. I'm guessing some of us can relate to that. You know, it's been a lot of at home time, a lot of things, a lot of crazy times that we've been going through. And I'm just curious, you know, how you feel that some of the folks have really handled the whole COVID crisis in relation to being introverts or extroverts. So I'll give you a slide here, just something to think about. You know, what are some of the reactions? How likely have they been to accept some of this change? You know, how they handle work from home, since most of them have been doing that at least somewhat. How comfortable are they with social distancing? Is that really great? Is that a challenge? How do they act not only in meetings that we've typically had in person, where we've got all the verbal and nonverbal, but maybe in some of these virtual meetings, maybe where it's a Zoom meeting and we can actually see everyone and you start talking. And then even thinking about going back to work. Are they excited? Do they have some concerns? Are there things that you could point to that have to do with the specific styles that you've noticed, how they might have handled things differently? And again, I'm going to open it up if anybody would like to type, or if you'd like to unmute, you let me know and I'll call on you and ask you to unmute if you'd like. Well, Fern told me earlier that she would be interested in being called on, so I'm going to ask her to unmute and see if she has any perspectives on how people have reacted with her team based on styles.
Well, thank you, Jeanette. I guess that you know, I've seen a lot of comments online and social media that introverts are feeling pretty comfortable with the idea of social distancing and staying home, but I also wonder if it will make it that much more anxiety ridden, that if they'll give them that much more stress when they do come back to work or they do come back to social situations, and how we can come back into being comfortable.
And that's kind of where I was going with it too, Fern. I was suspecting that that might be the case. I don't know, now that things are starting to open up a little bit, if anyone in the group has actually experienced that yet and seen how they react.
Jeanette, it's Nicole. I might add, just from observation, you know, just with our own team here at the chamber, that one of the things I noticed that with some of our introverts, the change to telework, that was, I think, in some cases, you know, for just, and this is just, like I said, just what I've seen, but I think for some of the introverts, that change was difficult for them because it was a change of routine, and it, you know, the normality of their day changed. For the extroverts, the difficulty for them was more when they went, you know, to work from home, was, missing the interaction with their peers and, and colleagues, and, working from home. And, so now once we've come back, I feel like everybody kind of fell back into their own, roles just like before.
Interesting. Good. And that's something I hadn't mentioned earlier, but that's a very good point about one of the challenges for an introvert is change, rapid change, and really being able to sort that through in their mind. So while they may like working on their own, so to speak, it's a change and they have to take a little more time to filter through that. But it is interesting that you said that they fall back into it, and maybe that's what will happen. I'm just curious. I don't know if anybody has, I've noticed in virtual meetings and even the social, the happy hour Zooms or whatever, you have a couple, if you have several people on, more than, I don't know, 3 or 4, it's not unusual for some of the extroverts to take over the conversation. And unfortunately, in the virtual environment, and you and I talked about this earlier, Nicole, it can be very difficult because it just doesn't work really well when you have several people trying to talk at once. So those things are a little bit different to handle. So I don't know if anyone else has anything to add with that, but I think the point being that what your style is kind of is your go-to reaction to things. And we can almost start to predict some of these things as to what will happen. So now, we've got this roadmap. Things are gradually starting to open up. I don't know how many of you on the call have started to bring people back or not, but it's important we look at kind of this term, this new normal, and what it's going to mean in, I think this is an opportunity to think about it in Garrett County. That may or may not be like other places in the world, so to speak, but what will our workplaces look like? As I look at the attendee list, most of the people on this particular call, although certainly not all, there's a lot of people in offices and companies. The workplace in terms of retail and so on, might look even different. What is going to be the mix? Will everybody be on site once again? Will there be some mix of virtual with that? Maybe people working a day or 2 at home. Maybe a virtual person from out of the area, assuming that, there's strong internet and that can all work. You're seeing some talk about urban versus rural. Nicole and Regina and I and Fern were talking about this just on Monday, and certainly Garrett County, we believe, in the Lake area, we hope will be benefiting from this idea of having a drivable distance for your vacation. Now, whether that will impact other things workplace-wise, I don't know. I think there can be opportunities for us as a group. There may be some challenges. So, I just kind of like to open that up again for a little bit of chat, and I think that might be better unmuting. So if someone wants to type speak, if they'd like to speak up, then I'll ask you to go ahead and unmute and just give me your thoughts. There's certainly not a right or wrong, but what are you seeing and what are you hearing in your organizations? Okay, Chuck, let me hear it. What's happening at the bank?
Yeah, about 60% of our employees are working virtually now for going on the 4th month. And, and I know we've actually met as a group to talk about the virtual workplace. But, I think one of the outcomes of this is going to be is that, a lot of the efficiencies that are being gained and figured out because of working remotely are going to stick. And I guess the way I would put it is that the science and the HR side of the virtual workplace is probably going to be pretty permanent going forward. The benefits, I think, have outweighed the negatives in a lot of ways. I think there's a lot more personal balance that's been created for people, a lot more ability to focus on being more, efficient with time and being able to focus on priorities because of less distractions. So from the business application, there's a lot of things in there. But to the point of this conversation, I think it's been interesting to watch how, especially with the advent of Microsoft Teams and Zoom and all these things, that if we didn't have it, it wouldn't work, because the extrovert does need those connections. And I think all your points up to this point have been spot on, especially for the introverts who have now adjusted. But the question is, do they like it? And the ones that I talk to are still pretty uncomfortable with it. They like their old surroundings. They like the trappings of their stuff, as opposed to what they've been able to lug home and try to work that way.
So it's really kind of that change issue again.
Yeah, it really is. But it's I've always kind of had the personal belief that the principle of opportunity is change. So the opportunities here are huge for what businesses I think are going to go figure out going forward. I think I've read some things where Walmart has moved like 10,000 of their technology employees permanently home now. Obviously for COVID reasons, but that as companies continue to figure out the effectiveness of this, the question is, are there profitability gains because you won't need as much workspace to have them work in? Do we have the ability to connect with our customers better virtually than jumping in our car and driving in? We've not opened our doors to our customers yet, and when you talk to the revenue side of the bank, a lot of the things have been helped out a lot because of the government funding projects and things like that. But there's really been not a lot of interruption with our customer interactions to the extent that they have to walk in and go face to face. So, this is seismic in some ways, at least for the banking industry.
Yeah, and I've heard several people, as you know, I'm a part of Leadership Maryland, and as I hear other people talking about it, one of the things they said is, all the naysayers that said this could never happen, well, of course, we never expected a pandemic, but all the naysayers that said this technology can't work, the electronic signatures, all the things that we held back on, well, we found out they could work. Now, how much do you keep? How do you alter? But it certainly proved that things can happen. So thank you, Chuck. And Amy, if you don't mind, I'm going to call on you because you're bringing up a point that I've wondered a lot about, is this whole idea about, how's it going to be in the future, and that this whole recruiting, how recruiting is going to be different. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on what you all are thinking at Mount Morrow. Oh, she doesn't have a mic. Okay. One of the things that I remember very well, most of you know, I was a banker, which is why I'm very familiar with Chuck and what he's doing. It was very difficult to recruit for very hard to fill positions. So I realized that every challenge has not been met. I realize that there are broadband concerns, but I think there's still some opportunity to consider maybe some virtual type hires or some mix of that, or maybe even somebody that does want to get out of the city. But I realize that nothing is pointing to that yet to see, and it's going to be interesting. And I don't know if Amy has anything else to add on that, maybe in the chat, but I'm thinking that might be where she's coming from. And I'll just wait a second. Okay, if she comes back with anything else, we'll try to look at that. And I'm just going to ask one more person, because I'm just plain curious. My friend Janice, I'm curious with the college how this would be impacting, because again, what a change in the whole educational system. So Janice, I don't know if you're actively out there and able to speak up.
I'm here. I can speak. Can you hear me?
I sure can, thanks.
Well, we have meetings twice a week, the leadership team, and it's so hard to manage because everything changes. But basically, we're going to keep everybody in a telework environment as much as we can, and then just open offices gradually and have just one person per office work at different points in time. And hopefully by the fall, we'll have a modified hybrid schedule with the students.
Great. Have you seen anything, while I've got you on the line, anything with the different styles of how people have reacted to this kind of COVID thing?
It's interesting. I mean, we have some people that, of course, love it and want to continue it. And you know me, I'm an extrovert, and I actually kind of like it too, which is kind of but But I do go into the office though. I do get to go in at least once a week, and sometimes I don't see anybody, but it is nice just to be back in the office and have some normalcy about it. But you can see where tensions are running high in some meetings and whatnot, because some people like the technology. And then we talked about it yesterday in our meeting that sometimes the online meetings are actually more tense, and you just don't feel as comfortable as you would in a face-to-face setting. So I think as time goes on and you have to adapt to the new normal, we'll see how that works out.
Yeah, and I've read a lot on the fact that, and I've not obviously with my work had that situation, but when you're in the office and companies that have like Zoom meeting after Zoom meeting, that it can be extremely draining. So as a community of HR people, we'll have to figure that out on whatever that balance is. So thank you.
Well, Dr. McKenna's been great too. He's sometimes on a Friday he'll say, you know what, you guys just need to unplug. Just please unplug, because he knows, when you're in your home office, you tend to go into the office a lot more often, earlier, later, and whatnot. And at some point, he just says unplug. So I think
I think you're exactly right. I have a coaching client that is having some work-life balance issues for just that reason. And we talked about the fact you need to try to, go into your office, open the door, and then when you leave, you close the door. You take your phone like you normally would, but there is a boundary. So that's another side thing. Very good. Thank you, Janice. And Amy came back with some more comments, which you can read, but it's right along the line. We've considered offering certain positions the opportunity to work from home in the past. This made it more real, and we could see, as you said, it is doable. In HR, we aren't profit producing centers necessarily. However, telecommuters can reduce some overhead. And when space becomes an issue, telecommuting also becomes attractive. That's exactly true. And imagine if you're sitting in a major metropolitan area, not obviously Garrett County with those big office buildings and things. I think you're going to see some of that happen. My daughter works for Deloitte in Columbus, and they're already talking about, continuing some work from home and reducing some of the real estate costs. So lots of considerations. That's a little bit off of the introverts, extroverts, but I think their reaction to it is important to look at. And it's a conversation, again, we wouldn't have had a few months ago. So thank you so much for participating. I think the value of what you bring to the table is so much greater than the PowerPoint in front of you. So, now that we've talked about this, what do we do? How do we care? We are HR people, we're leaders in our organization. How do we care for, in the first case, introverts? And here are some basic tips. Again, you'll have the slides, but you need to respect their need for privacy. They are quieter. They like their space. They don't necessarily like change. We've talked about that. Never ever embarrass them in public. You wouldn't want to do that with anybody. I mean, that's a given. But realize sometimes, somebody that's an introvert needs time to absorb things. And one of the worst things too that you could ever have with an introvert is if they feel that their work is not of the value that you expect, because they are, they're the quality checkers. They want it to be right. So you wouldn't ever want to do that. They're not necessarily wanting recognition, and certainly not embarrassment in public. Let them observe first, give them time, just like we said, easing into the work at home. We didn't have time, unfortunately, in this situation to ease at home. But if we had, it would have been good to give them a little extra time to think about it. Don't make them react immediately. Don't interrupt them. Boy, that's tough, because those of us that are a little more extroverted, our mind is going, and we have something we know is just wonderful to say. But if we sit back, like Chuck had said earlier, and realize that they are really good thinkers, allow them to speak and to get their words out. And we'll all be better because of it. Give them notice ahead, again, if there's changes. We couldn't necessarily do that with this silly pandemic, but, where we can, it's much more valuable. And, give them some warning with some time frame, whatever they're doing. Reprimand them privately. I would say that with anyone, but realize it can be even more impactful sometimes with an introvert. They like that one-on-one, teaching their skills more privately, letting them work on things on their own a little bit more and checking back. Enable them to, we say, find one best friend, but somebody that they're comfortable with. They generally are not people that are going to have 20 great friends that hang out all the time, but they have one or two go-to people, and we all need that in our work life. Don't push them to make a lot of friends. Don't push them into social situations unless, you know, it's the type of role that you need to have some of that. And then there's ways that you can adjust that. And respect that, you know, introverts. Don't try to enable them to or make them into becoming extroverts. They just don't know better, so they need to be like us. No, it's their style. We talked at the beginning of the hour about the great traits that they bring with that style, and we need to respect that and to keep that in mind. So if we want to try to connect with them better, and we want people within the office environment or the work environment to connect better, here's a few tips to think about. Many times the introverts, because they are thinkers, they look at facts. They want to see when they're looking at things and they're evaluating, how is this going to work? How could this virtual workplace work? They're going to look at facts. What have we seen? They want to see it to be very objective because it's about the issue. It's not necessarily emotional first. Their go-to is getting to the actual issues and then making a decision. And they're not always as quick of a decision as others might make in the office because they're going through this very careful analysis. And realize that they will be the skeptical one in the meeting. That's their first go-to many times. It doesn't mean that they're the negative Nelly. It just means that they're like that. They need to think through it. Their first reaction is, you know, what could go wrong? And then they can come back to how it could be right. Now, again, I'm talking in generalities. I'm talking extremes, but you may see some of these traits. There's time when you have to problem solve. They're going to need a little more time. So for instance, in a work environment, if there's things, there's spreadsheets, there's data, there's articles that you can provide ahead of the time when you're sitting there and getting ready to make those issues, get through and solve the problems, that's great. Give them time ahead to think it through and so that they are prepared. And appreciate the fact that they are the ones that are going to bring the logic and orders. Your extroverts are coming up with all this brainstorming, and the introverts are going to be the ones that are going to sit down logically and see how well it's going to work out the details. Now, the downside is they can sometimes get pulled into all those details at such a level that they have a hard time actually making the decision. So we need to sometimes keep that in mind and help them to get out of the details too, at the right time, at the right place. And we all know as we're working through this problem solving, there's different stages of that, from the brainstorming to the evaluation and so on. And things will sometimes get tense, and Janice mentioned some of those. And, you know, for the introverts, whatever opinion that you have, if you can show the logic and the facts behind it. Sometimes, again, the extreme, the extroverts are going to show the emotion and the passion, and that doesn't always work really well with introverts. They tend to want to see the logic and the facts as to how you get there. And if you push them on the enthusiasm without the logic and the facts, you sometimes stub your toes. So they need to base it on that. Give them the space and the time to process. It was interesting, the comment about, you know, they actually like having their space back in the office because it was their way and it was all a certain way. So, you know, give them some of that, respect that. And again, don't get overly forceful or emotional, because if anything, it may shut them down, where they may just literally put their foot in the sand and say, I'm not going anywhere, generally by not commenting and just thinking this will go away. I won't allow it to happen. So that doesn't work. You've got to work through the process and help them through it. And just some general management tips with that. Let them work independently when they can. That doesn't mean they don't ever have any contact, for heaven's sakes, but they do like to work independently. They like to have that space and to do it themselves and to keep the quality and the effort the way they see it. Give them time to make decisions. Use deadlines to ensure their progress. So in other words, that's a way to manage the fact that they could get stuck in the details and miss the deadlines. So if you have manageable deadlines and check-ins at those points, that will help it. And remember, these are the folks that can really help you with the quality goals. They're going to be the ones that, again, they're skeptical, so they can see the things that might go wrong. So they're going to give you the things that will help you to keep you on the quality level that you need. So again, very important parts of the team and need to be leveraged and managed in different ways. So before I go on to extroverts, I'll just give you just a second if anybody has a chat thoughts that they had based on what we just said about the introverts. Things that you've learned, things that you've seen. Okay. So we talked about the introverts. Well, we sure have to care for those extroverts too, because they need care and feeding, but in a different way. So you need to respect their independence, because as you know, it was such a great comment, I think it was Melissa earlier saying about, you know, they need to be seen, they need to be heard. So let them tell their thoughts. And I've often said you don't always have to agree with an extrovert, but you probably better listen because they need to be heard. And, you know, they do like a little bit of a pat on the back and to be seen positively among their peers. It's not so much ego as it is just kind of a self-respect type of things. So, you know, they're totally fine with compliments or that was great. Introverts like compliments too, but maybe not as flowery perhaps as the extroverts. You need to accept and actually encourage their enthusiasm because it will help. It'll give you the creativity, be the good things. You manage it, but encourage it because it can help. Allow them to explore and talk things out. As I got into some of the disc work that I do, that was one of the things that just became so obvious to me that many times an extrovert will start talking and guess what? They haven't figured it all out yet. And as they talk through it is how they get there. So you need to give them that time. And, you know, thoughtfully, you know, surprise them, give them understanding when they're busy, let them dive right in because, you know, they're excited, they like a good challenge, they want to jump in right away. Offer them options because they like some level of control, make the physical and verbal gestures of affection. Now, obviously, we're not talking about the extreme of that, but showing that they're being heard and so on and acceptance. And let them shine. They love to be out front. They're happy to do that. Others don't. So use that and leverage those opportunities where it makes sense. So again, what do we do differently with extroverts? Well, remember the extrovert really likes some level of collaboration. They want to get back. I think Chuck made the comment about, you know, the people that the extroverts are kind of anxious to get back with live people, or they really like a virtual meeting as opposed to maybe a call because they can get some of that feedback and see the actual visual. Recognize the value of energy and enthusiasm. We talked about that. That's if you're talking to an extrovert and it may not come naturally to you, if you can adapt your style just a little bit to show some of that energy and enthusiasm and to match it, the conversation will go so much better. If you are very you know, straight-faced and you're not showing any kind of emotion at all, that can be frustrating for somebody that is extroverted. So, you know, pipe up the energy just a little bit to keep it going and help them to understand that they are appreciated, they're well liked. Even if you don't agree, it's not about them personally, it's about the issue. And many times, I often say from a purchasing perspective, the way that an extrovert or an I in the disc language gets there is they need to feel comfortable with the person they're talking with first, and then they'll get to the issue. So it's not unlike the communication within the office. Problems do need to be solved. Again, I spoke earlier about the fact that they'd like to see that optimism. And even though, gosh, you can't be optimistic right off on some things, especially with what we've had to deal with, we can be optimistic in the end. And as some of our conversation was earlier, you know, this situation of what we've been through could actually optimistically provide us some opportunities in the future. You know, we'll work with it and make it happen, and those introverts will help keep us in line, but it could be opportunities. There could be very creative solutions, and, you know, expect that they're going to be spontaneous, which can be really positive You just might have to rein it in on times to bring them back to what the issue is, but allow them to have some of that because it drives them and gets their energy headed in the direction. Sometimes things will get tense, especially, as we said, the introverts and extroverts colliding. It's important not to have a personal attack. We kind of talked about that with both, but with the extroverts, really that self-respect is important. And if they feel that they are being personally attacked, you just went after them, you always knock down their ideas, they have a hard time staying focused on what the issue is, because inside all they're hearing is, they don't appreciate me, they don't think I know anything, those kinds of things. That's the pitfall sometimes of an extrovert, is some of their internal talk. So realize that and acknowledge how they're feeling and where they're coming from, and let them know that, hey, this is all going to be okay between all of us. Even though we may disagree, at the end of the day, we have a good working relationship. I appreciate what you do, you appreciate what I do, and so on. Keeping it on that playing field. So what helps with an extrovert when you're managing? Well, vary their tasks. Quite frankly, they get bored. They like new and fresh. So if you can reinvent some things, or if something just happened, unlike the introvert, actually extroverts sometimes thrive on some change. So they'd like to keep it fresh. Again, public praise is wonderful. And we said, don't mistake the enthusiasm for understanding. I kind of mentioned that earlier. They can be all excited. Oh, I'll be happy to take on that project. That'll just be terrific. Well, you need to ask a few more questions, because they may be enthusiastic, but not really understand what all the pieces are. And there's very, very effective ways you can do that. And you might have to keep them on schedule for a different reason than some of the introverts. The eyes get excited, and sometimes we laugh and say they see the butterfly go over to this next project because they like things fresh, they like new tasks. They will sometimes, pop from project to project and miss that scheduled deadline. So you just have to check in and kind of keep them on task, so that the job actually does get done at the end of the day. So really what we're talking about, and we've been talking about through this whole session, is getting to know your associates, getting to know their styles, their work styles, their preferences. And in the role of leadership that all of us are in, we need to figure out what makes them tick. What can we do? We can coach them and help them through things. A lot of it is how we adapt our styles to meet where they are. And just taking a few minutes ahead of time, or when you see these things maybe starting to go awry, and to go back over some of those tips and to think through where they're coming from, and how can you keep their enthusiasm and their energy and their work process and their good quality there, because you understand their style and you understand how to adapt. And also coaching your associates who are obviously having some of these interactions that may go awry. If you see that, being able to pull them aside and kind of talking to them in terms of what went on and stylistic things, not necessarily because Susie or Johnny is always this way, but these are the things, and we find sometimes when people react this way, it's because they're thinking this, and help them with some adapting stuff, things that you can do. And again, as many of you know, there are profiles and things and classes that can help you with that. But hopefully, a few of the quick tips that we've had today might be helpful for you in those terms. So let me just open up the chat one more time. Any quick thoughts on some of the tips we were talking about, and certainly any tips that you have that I haven't thought of mentioning, I would love for you to put out there so I can steal it for later. Okay, Fern, let's hear what you have to say.
Well, it just, listening to the similarities between the introverts and the extroverts, my big takeaway is that, as a manager of people and as someone who interacts with customers, that really my responsibility is to listen because nobody's going to come up to me and say, "Hi, I'm an introvert," you know, and
Right.
or "Hi, I'm an extrovert," even though it may be obvious. And then it really, whether it is that they need the space that an introvert needs, or they need the encouragement that an extrovert needs, it just seems to me that, you know, my job is to listen carefully and to take those cues. So really, my kind of takeaway from this was it doesn't really matter if I'm an introvert or if I'm an extrovert. My job as the manager is to really try to be observant and interact with people outside of my natural inclinations. I need to give, does that make sense?
Absolutely, absolutely. And that's one of the things we go through some of the classes, and some of the folks on the screen have done this. You know, you're right. No one's going to say I'm an introvert or an extrovert. The key is really be able to kind of people read, observe, listen, and watch, and then kind of go back and absorb some of the things perhaps that we've talked about. And then how can you adapt best to meet their needs? How can you communicate with them more effectively? And that's really what we're talking about. So thank you. And Nicole, that kind of starts to touch on your thing about, you know, when you have this introvert and extrovert and they're clashing, what's the best way to solve this? And I think the first step that Fern talked about was absolutely right. Really observing, watching, seeing what's going on, and start to identify the concerns. Then I might suggest at that point working with each of those, I'm assuming it's two people at that time, maybe individually, and helping the introvert, keeping in mind what their needs are, and then helping them to understand the needs of this extrovert, where they're coming from, and how they might be able to adapt their style a little bit to communicate better. And really, you're going to do the same thing with this extrovert about communicating with the introvert. I've actually had coaching situations where I'm coaching a variety of people, and in some cases they actually work together. And of course, we keep it confidential, but it's really interesting once they learn this. I'll hear from the one, you know, Johnny saying, well, for some reason, I'm getting along with Susie much better. And Susie says, you know, that Johnny, he's not as bad as I thought he was, because they start to make those adaptations. And, you know, I just kind of smile, say, that's great. Apparently it's working. But that's really all it is learning how to adapt that style and being respectful of what their needs are. Now, there's always a problem, there's always an issue, there's an opportunity. That's kind of the guts of what you're talking about. But what we're really talking about is the communication, the positive, productive communication that needs to take place so these other things can happen.
I told Jessie when these are gone, I'm never getting my nails done.
Okay, any other thoughts?
Okay, so look at the picture that I showed her. You know, I showed it to you.
Okay, Holly, I think you might have your speaker on. So at the end of the day, we're business people, right? I mean, whether, you know, we're at the college or we're at Beitzel or we're at First United or Simon Pierce, we're business people. So our role as leaders in the business is to make the business successful. We talked about some things about, you know, the ROI, the engagement, the recruitment, all the things we do. But we want our business to be successful. And the one takeaway I can firmly share with you is when we can engage our associates and the leaders and leverage the best things of these varied styles of each team member, we will be more successful. Many of you have heard me talk about diversity, certainly on our minds today, but there's also diversity beyond those kind of issues and diversity of styles and thinking processes. I was on a call the other day. It was very interesting. It was somebody that was from the Baltimore area, and they were saying in their organization, they had just hired this leader, this one leader from New York. And he started talking right away how the guy was not going to fit in. You know, they're just not the same as the rest. And I thought, wow, you know, you're going to have to work on this a little bit, because yeah, they do talk a little faster than us, but you know, they also bring a lot of good things. And if we can understand the differences and help to manage these kinds of things, we'll have a much more robust and more successful organization. And gosh, you know, I was born and raised in Garrett County. I want to see that across the whole county. It makes me extremely proud when I see those kinds of things. So I wish all the best for all of you. Please know that, I'm available. I'll be happy to talk with you anytime. As you know, I like to talk. But, drop me a line and we'll get together and we'll talk about some of these things. And again, if I can help at all, I'd be very happy to do that. So I guess I just open up one more time to see if there's any more thoughts or questions before we close out my portion.
So Jeanette, this is Nicole, and just out of curiosity, when you talk about training and working with your staff, obviously when you have new staff people come on, you have, the whole team has to learn about that person, learn how, whether or not they're an introvert, extrovert, or how they prefer to work as part of that team. And a lot of that's a bit of a learning exercise for everybody on the team. But what would you recommend, like teams that have been together for a while, and we've done the different types of like DISC and some of those other personality testing things, but what would you recommend for teams that have been together for a while, as kind of refreshers or training, team building exercises that they can do? Because sometimes we forget that, we have these different personalities, these different characteristics for different individuals, and certainly, how it is what type of work environment is best for them. So I don't know if you have any recommendations, how often you would do that, and what would be the best type?
Yeah, I think it's, management in the moment, so to speak. Each organization is going to be a little bit different, but you bring up a good point. Obviously my go-to, and the chamber has gone through this, is some kind of DISC or some other program similar to that. But you're right, you do need to keep bringing it back, and there's some ideas there, but there's some simple things that I've seen work that, doesn't cost any money, and it's really easy. One of the things I've seen is people taking like just a little piece of paper, and what are the 3 things I would like my coworkers to know about me? And you can kind of go around the table and have discussion around that. The other thing that's kind of fun is to just write those down and then pull them out of the bag and try to guess who that person is, and to have some conversation. Sometimes what it is how you could work better with me. And then you naturally get into that. And that's kind of a cheap, fun, easy kind of thing that you could even do as part of a staff meeting. I think another thing, especially if you were maybe a little more in a more intense meeting or a little bit of strategy type things, I think sometimes it's helpful to look at a particular project or things that you've just gone through, hopefully something that's been successful. And you can start to point out and show why it was successful, and stage it so that you can see every person added different dimensions and why that worked well, and how you can make that work into the future. So those are a couple quick ideas that I can think of just off the top of my head. But it is important to have those discussions. It really is, because it'll vary. And also the idea of onboarding and bringing new people, having those conversations is good, helping them to understand the styles, others to understand about them. And again, on the side, which would take a whole other meeting, but how do you do that in a virtual world? And I think that's going to provide some challenges going forward, how to make that work. But certainly not insurmountable things to think about.
Well, and kind of as a follow-up to that, Amy Burnhouse had mentioned earlier that they're considering actually having, some doing more telework, that
Right.
They know that it is certainly doable now. So I guess the question is, if you do, for us, telework was temporary, and now we're all back together again. But if you are doing more of the telework, how do you keep, especially if you have those introverts and extroverts, and people handle those virtual meetings, and handle working remotely in very different ways? How do you recommend to make sure that your team stays, sticks together if you have more people working virtually?
Yeah, I think I'm not sure I have the silver bullet on that. I think we're all learning. One of the things that I can think of right offhand is the fact that people will react differently to that. So, for instance, if you are managing different people, while your introverts tend to like that independence a little bit, except for the issue of the change, assuming they're used to it now. You're going to check in some with them the way you check in, maybe a little more email, an occasional call. However, the extrovert's going to need you to check in more often, if nothing else, just to have that contact. If I were coaching someone, maybe an introvert versus an extrovert, the extrovert, I probably would want to make sure I could do a virtual meeting. The introvert may prefer not to do it that way, but feel more comfortable with the phone. Now, there are things, certainly depending on the platforms, and I know that they're all across the board, what types that you use for these, but where you can actually, and I know that you all did this with your happy hour last month, where you can go into rooms. So I think you could do some things as a team, depending on the size, something with, the overall team, but maybe then you break into rooms and have some conversation with that and come back. I've often seen things sometimes where at the beginning of the meetings, they ask, a thought-provoking question and have everybody answer with that, and that helps some. Good point. Amy just put out a link to SkillPath, and there may be some good resources there that could help you. And I'm sure that there are, and gosh, if there's not somebody out there investing in how to learn how to do all this stuff, they're crazy. There's certainly an opportunity, and you're absolutely right. I'm familiar with SkillPath, Amy, and that it is a fairly low-cost leadership development training. So, I would be remiss, since I do some of that, to realize that you need some mix, but SkillPath could really help a lot with that, and includes working with telecommuters. That's great. I didn't realize that, but I would expect those big guys to have started to figure that out and have some tools for you. But I think also an organization like we have right here, where we can share some of that, whatever the overall topic is, as we can actually collaborate more and talk more on some of these issues. I think that can really help, because there's a real brain trust going on just within the folks in this particular session. And I would hate for us to see to lose that. I think the benefit is to be able to have those conversations and to learn from each other as professionals. I hope that helps.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you.
Certainly. Any other thoughts or ideas? Wonderful. Maybe we've even gotten to the point where we can see some future topics to help the roundtable. So a lot of good opportunity. Again, please know I'm there if you need me, and I certainly am very pleased to be able to do this, and honored to be a part of the session. So thank you all, and I'll turn it back over to Nicole and Fern, or whomever wants to speak next.
That's Fern.
Thank you, ladies. Thank you, Jeannette. This was really timely, I think really beneficial. I know I got a lot out of it, and I just wanted to personally thank you. And thank you everyone who attended this morning's HR Roundtable meeting. I just wanted to remind everyone that we take our summer break in July and August, so we will not have any of these meetings for the next couple of months. But the next HR Roundtable meeting will be held Wednesday, September 2nd. And the topic and the speaker are yet to be determined. We will announce them soon. So again, I just want to thank everyone who participated this morning.
Great. Thank you.
Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you very much. And just a reminder that today's program was recorded. So if you would like to watch it or share it with someone, we will be posting the link. So thank you, everybody. Have a great day.